EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Texas will never forget the Alamo, but the State Board of Education recently revised its grade-level social studies standards, and there are some surprises among the list of historical figures who did not make the cut. Joining us today is the reporter who broke this now viral story. It's Lauren McGaughy of the Dallas Morning News. Lauren, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on your show.
I want to mention to our listeners who may be hearing some unusual background noise, Lauren was kind enough to join us from a road trip in New York City, so we get a little bit of extra sound and color this week. So how did you end up on this story?
I have covered public education and higher ed for a while, but I kind of thought I had moved away from the beat. And my editor asked me to cover a meeting of the Texas State Board of Education because they just didn't have anyone else to do it that day. And I'd covered the board before. And little did I know that I was coming into yet another controversy. The board makes a lot of controversial decisions, and this just happened to be yet another one of them that I would have to tackle in a pretty short period of time. So it was a little bit of a fluke, but, I always love digging into these stories. So it kind of ended up being extra fun for me this time.
I thought that the process by which this decision was made was just as interesting as the outcome, which has gotten all the headlines. So let's just walk through this. It's a committee of essentially volunteers, some teachers and some parents. What are the qualifications to get on this committee?
I'm really glad that we're talking about this because, not a lot of people want to dig into how this actually happened. It's so much about, the viral headline. So every year, the State Board of Education revises and updates both the curriculum and sometimes textbooks as well for different grades. It might be science, it might be health, it could be almost anything. This year, they decided they wanted to streamline, that's the word they use, their social studies curriculum for all grades, K through 12. Teachers have been complaining that too many historical figures are required to be taught in every grade, that the required lessons are really, really long and broad. And so they assembled this group of volunteers to look at what are called the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, the TEKS, and to revise and shorten them. The volunteers are nominated by the 15 members Texas State Board of Education, which is an elected board. And really anyone can serve on that board. You don't have to be a teacher. You don't have to be a parent. They usually have an education background, but these volunteers don't necessarily need to have any real nitty-gritty knowledge about education or how it works.
They also don't need a background necessarily in history. I mean, the rubric that they came up with for adjudicating somebody's historical value is really, they did this on their own.
They did, yeah. Actually, I was talking to one of the volunteers who is a teacher, and I want to make it clear that almost all of them are teachers or have been involved in instructional materials or something like that. But one of the teachers I was speaking to who was in the volunteer group that created this rubric said that they spent an entire day just creating the rubric. So they were told, cut some people out of the curriculum, and they thought, how are we going to do that without making it look like this was just a subjective choice by these 15 people, the volunteers. And so they created a rubric with all of these different categories and values, and people got points for things like whether they came from an underrepresented group, whether their impact would be lasting beyond their lifetime or our lifetime. And they gave points to each person, but it was really just 15 people in a room together that had complete control over how they were going to recommend these social studies curriculums were going to be reduced.
Well, let's talk about the headlines. In addition to Hillary Clinton and Helen Keller, who are a few other people who were dropped from the list?
We actually did a searchable database of every single historical figure on the rubric. So if you go to dallasnews.com, you can see how each individual person scored out of either a maximum score of 20 points or 21 points, depending on what grade they were in, and then whether that historical figure was recommended for deletion. Obviously, the headlines were about Helen Keller and Hillary Clinton, but there were 64, I think, is the total number of people that were cut from grades 1 through 12. And they really run the gamut. Barry Goldwater was recommended for deletion. John Hancock, who we all know as, the most famous signer of the Declaration of Independence, was recommended for deletion from both of the grades that he was taught in. So he was not only was he taught in 2 grades, but he is now being removed from both grades. So now kids aren't required to learn about him in any grade. And really the list goes on. Oprah Winfrey, the man who founded the famous Amos Cookie Company, on and on and on. What's really interesting is that the group of volunteers was only making recommendations to the board. They created the rubric, they scored everyone, and then they said, you should cut these people from the curriculum. But the board, at the end of the day, has the sole authority to make any of these decisions final. So the group of volunteers, which are mostly teachers, yes, they recommended Hillary Clinton be cut, but in that same grade and in that same part of the curriculum, they also recommended that Billy Graham, the pastor and evangelist, be removed. But the board decided to put Billy Graham back in. So even though Graham scored very low on the rubric, the board had the decision-making power to reinsert him into the curriculum, and they did that last week when they took their preliminary vote.
And that is really important for us to emphasize here, in part because Billy Graham overlaps with what you reported the board's priority to be related to emphasizing Judeo-Christian values. Talk a little bit about that.
The board was streamlining the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills social studies curriculum for every grade. So this wasn't just historical figures. It was, how do we talk about the writing of our founding documents? How do we talk about famous entrepreneurs? I mean, this is every single history and social studies course, grades kindergarten through 12th grade. So the teachers not only went through and recommended deletions for historical figures, but they recommended changes. Let's update this. We have new information about this fact or this person. Let's change this language. And the group of volunteers, which was mostly teachers, recommended to remove multiple references to Judeo-Christian values in the curriculum in Texas. There are references to legal theories, they say, based on Judeo-Christian values, government influences. There's even a reference in there that Moses influenced the writing of our founding documents. And the group of volunteer teachers said that that was inaccurate. They said that there was no historical proof that Moses was an influence on the founders, and that the term Judeo-Christian actually wasn't even in existence when the founders were creating what we now know as the United States of America. So they recommended these terms be removed from the curriculum. But the board, after being heavily lobbied by a number of Christian advocacy organizations publicly, decided to reinsert those references to Judeo-Christian values back into the social studies curriculum. And they did that in multiple places. I think 3 or 4 places they put them back in.
There's a part of your story that really jumped out at me, and it seemed to contradict anybody who tries to have a narrative here that this is strictly about conservative versus liberal or left versus right. And that is that the board voted to expand a section on the Civil War, amending it to recognize, quote, the central role of the expansion of slavery in causing the Civil War, among other contributing factors. Previously, slavery was just on a list of factors alongside states' rights. I thought that maybe should get a whole story of its own.
That's a really interesting conversation that's happening in Texas right now. And I know this is a little off topic, but there's a plaque that hangs in the Texas state capitol that was erected in 1959. And it was put up by a group called the Children of the Confederacy. It's an offshoot of the Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy. And the plaque serves no purpose other than to claim incorrectly that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. Literally what it says, we are the children of the Confederacy, and we want everyone to know that slavery did not cause what they call the war between the states. And so there's been this conversation in Texas about the rewriting of history, the discussion of the Civil War. So it was really pretty shocking for a lot of people that the board actually voted to, in the curriculum, in the social studies curriculum, make it very clear that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War. And you're right, it hasn't gotten a lot of discussion up until this point.
We're talking with Lauren McGaughy of the Dallas Morning News about her coverage of controversial changes to Texas's social studies standards. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. This week's episode is sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. CZI believes that every child should enter adulthood able to recognize and realize their full potential, and that a whole child approach to personalized learning is the most promising way to achieve this vision. Visit chanzuckerberg.com/education for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Lauren, I thought this was a great example of how much control states actually have over what kids learn. Put this in context for us, if you will, with the decision by Texas not to sign on to the Common Core state standards.
So Texas doesn't teach the Common Core. They've been very outspoken about that. Both the Texas State Board of Education and the legislature have actually voted to, I guess you could say, illegalize Common Core in Texas. You cannot teach Common Core in the state of Texas, which means that, there are 5.4 million school children in the state of Texas who are learning something different than what children in a lot of other states are learning. And the reason why it's important, as you know, and, a lot of education writers know, is that Texas has an outsized influence on curriculum and textbooks. And while textbooks are less important now than they were in the past when it was, we were only talking about learning from a book instead of online, these textbook producers or these curriculum producers will conform to what's in the Texas curriculum because they have so many students there. So it's been really interesting to see how other states are responding to this because they, maybe they don't want to have to learn the same thing that students in Texas are learning.
Texas has a messy recent history when it comes to issues related to special education students. As Brian Rosenthal reported for the Houston Chronicle, the state shortchanged services for hundreds of thousands of kids for many years. Is that complicating the decision to remove Helen Keller? I mean, arguably, she changed how the country viewed individuals with severe physical disabilities.
I don't think they're related at all. When you talk to the teachers that were involved in the decision to recommend Helen Keller's deletion, I think it might have actually been an oversight. And I haven't actually got to say that until now. Helen Keller was only taught in one grade in Texas, and she scored low on the rubric, which, you can have an argument about why Helen Keller scored so low on the historical figures rubric. But I think that maybe the teachers that were involved in that conversation didn't realize that she wasn't required to be taught in any other grade. There is a discussion now about whether to put her back in and whether to put other historical figures back in. The board voted preliminarily to delete Helen Keller, Hillary Clinton, and a number of other people, but they have until November to change their minds. That's when they take their final vote. The Helen Keller decision particularly, I think, hits a lot of us. I don't know about you, Emily, but when I was growing up, I feel like we spent a whole week learning about Helen Keller.
Absolutely. It was my first book report, Lauren, in the third grade. I wrote a biography of Helen Keller. I mean, it's such a touchstone. And this story made me feel a little bit old, but then I thought, maybe she's timeless. But I do think, maybe a little bit in defense of that committee, she scored low because they were rating her for where she was placed, which was about citizenship.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that that's where I'd put her either.
Exactly. And that's what's being lost in the viralness of this story. I've gone on TV a couple of times, and I don't want to knock, the 24-hour news cycle, but all they want to talk about is, oh, look at how terrible this is, and they're getting cut, and we're rewriting history. And that's a really inaccurate description of what's happening. I think the teachers on this committee were told that they needed to reduce the number of historical figures that were taught in the classroom because teachers are telling people regularly, kids aren't learning. If you're a fourth grader and you're required to learn 70 people in your social studies class, you're just going to memorize them. You're not actually going to be learning about their lives. So I feel like the committee maybe thought that they were doing the right thing. What I'd really like education writers to learn from what I learned is this might be a viral story, but really I think it's likely being misinterpreted by a lot of people. The teachers on the committee, the volunteer committee, were asked to reduce the number of historical figures that students have to learn in the classroom. They thought they were doing the right thing. Now, we weren't in the room when they made those decisions, so maybe some of them were political. But at the end of the day, they want kids to actually be learning about these figures. And maybe there are too many included in the required lessons.
One of the lessons here for reporters, and I realize I'm preaching to the choir in a lot of ways, is, read the whole story. Your story is very thorough, it's very complete, it's got nuance, and these headlines are kind of fun to pull out. But I really do think this is a terrific example when we talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act restoring more local control. There's already quite a bit of local control among states. I mean, Texas is not unique in this, in that they set the actual curriculum standards for what kids are supposed to learn. I wanted to point out that you also made smart use of data for this piece, including letting readers search the rubric themselves for some familiar names. I'll admit, I went in there, I did a little searching around. I looked for Ida B. Wells. She's in there. Did you do any searching?
I did. I searched for Martin Luther King. I think he's like one of the ones that everyone would search for. Martin Luther King is taught in multiple grades in Texas, and he has not been recommended for deletion. And there's a lot of people that didn't get deleted. And, the story has become more about who has been recommended for elimination than who's actually still being taught in Texas classrooms. I want to make clear that while these historical figures like Helen Keller and Hillary Clinton had been recommended for deletion from the curriculum, teachers are still allowed to teach them. Teachers are not prohibited from talking to students about Clinton or anyone else that they might feel is important to history. They're just no longer considered essential either for that grade or for that subject. Helen Keller was in kind of a strange place in the curriculum. She was supposed to be taught to students about how to be a good citizen of the United States. Maybe we should be talking about her achievements for people with disabilities. She was the first blind deaf person to get a bachelor's degree. Maybe we should be talking about her in the government courses. She helped found the ACLU. So perhaps some of these historical figures who are recommended for deletion are just in the wrong place in the curriculum rather than they should be recommended for erasure completely.
Lauren McGaughy covers state government for the Dallas Morning News, and we're always delighted when she has an opportunity to cross back over to the education beat. Lauren, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, and thanks for sticking with me through all of the New York noise today. I really appreciate it.
That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you'd like to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.